Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's episode, Trouble Looming. Coming up in episode 20, I search for a way to make this project even more convoluted. Nick takes steps to allay the fears of the internet. And we both consult the experts on what colour to paint the Mini.
Rainbow! Pink.
At the end of the previous episode, we'd made a pretty good start on wiring the Mini. I've got to be honest, we were worried. We weren't entirely sure how interesting wiring could be. Turns out there was quite a lot of interest, which is a good thing because right now we've got some more wiring.
And the first thing we need to do some more wiring is to get rid of all this wiring.
Yes, I know, it all seems a bit arse backwards, but as usual, there's method in our madness. To make the centre console a little neater, we decided it would be a nice idea to bring the main harness up from the fuse box behind the front seat mount, and then along the tunnel to the front. You'll see what I mean in a minute after Nick's hacked a channel out of the tunnel and closed it up again. After the battery is removed and the handbrake is dumped unceremoniously out of the way, Nick whips out his favourite tool and scythes his way through the transmission tunnel. Since making the tunnel many moons ago, it's had more surgery than Katie Price has had boob jobs. The finger sander takes away the sharp edges, and then it's onto the bench to whip up a cardboard template. Must check to see if the measurements are correct. Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty good. As is customary, the template is transferred to the steel, cut out with the grinder, and then bent into shape. A little lick of weld-through etch primer finishes off the part. Nick lines up the plate in the hole before gently massaging it with the slight adjuster. I wonder if it's level and square. Make the noise! With the plate all squared up, it gets tacked into the tunnel. Here's the cable run in front of the seat mount, and here it is now running through the new channel.
That's much neater. And now we can get on with some actual wiring, which means taking a look at this lot. A lot of people are a bit scared of wiring, and when you see this, it's kind of easy to understand why. But the thing to do with any wiring is break it down into smaller chunks rather than trying to deal with all of this at once. So what we want to do first is sort out all of the front end lighting on the car, so that's what we're going to separate out of this jumble.
A jumble it certainly is, but after taking the time to unwrap and relabel the loom, finding the front light cabling was relatively easy. After disregarding all of the stuff that we're not interested in at this point, we've managed to pare back all that massive jumble of cables down to these 12 wires, 4 of which are earths. These earths, or grounds if you're watching in black and white, are all connected to one another in a massive jumble of messy wiring that we don't want to deal with, so we're going to do our own. And that leaves us with just 8 wires, all of different colours, which are traceable throughout the loom. Now I'm with a lot of you. I hate wiring, so this is like immersion therapy for me. But now we've simplified the front light circuit down this far, even I'm confident enough to do this. Well, that felt pretty good. I just hope I don't regret that a little later on. Now that I've snipped off all the connectors, it's a case of pulling all the wires back through the loom to a suitable position to branch them off. We're fixing the main loom into place here, so when we pull the lighting wires through the chassis leg, the lengths stay constant. After drilling an access hole in the box section, a stiff plastic tube is passed down the chassis leg and into the cabin for the wires to get jammed into. Putting the wires inside the tube makes it easy to pull it all through without getting snagged on anything. we're using the same run along the bulkhead as the battery cable. Now all we need to do is terminate the ends of the new earth cables. These strippers and crimpers have seen a lot of action over the years, as having the right tools for the job makes everything a lot easier and the result is a much more reliable system. The earth point I'm bolting this to was added to the A-post the thick end of 4 years ago, and now it's finally getting to see some action. The flip front is removable in one piece, which includes all the lights we're now wiring up. This necessitates having the cabling removable too, so to that end, we're mounting a sealed plug, like this one, somewhere where we can get to it without too much arsing around. This of course demands a bracket, obvs. We ummed and ahed about the position of this plug for what was probably far too long. We had it sitting on top of the chassis leg, excuse me, will you pipe down?
Sorry.
Inside the chassis leg, close to the bulkhead, pretty much everywhere within 500mm of where it'll sit now. It had to be easy to get to, but not foul or be in the way of anything else, so dangling it underneath the radiator support and using an existing mounting point ended up being our preferred choice. This half of the plug slides down onto a flat tab and is retained by a clip moulded into the housing to stop it jumping off. I think that'll work pretty well, and with a bit of luck, it won't interfere with the front end bodywork. Yeah, nice. Now with the plug position fixed, we can trim the wires to reuse the excess to connect up the lights in the flip front, all with the same coloured cabling.
This shouldn't really be too bad a job. I think the biggest challenge is going to be keeping everything tucked up out the way and neat. But, as usual, before we can actually run any wires, we need something to aim them at. So, to that end, and for your viewing pleasure, we need to install some of these standard mini side repeaters. We've also got the very last of the old shape mini front indicators. We've gone for these ones because they're much better sealed than the earlier type, and the lenses are less prone to falling off than the ones we originally had. And lastly, we've gone and bought some new headlight bowls. We've gone for plastic ones rather than the original steels because, well, they're cheaper, easier to get hold of, and they're much less likely to rust. I mean, obviously they still will rust because they're attached to a Mini, but should take a bit longer.
In typical fashion, the later front indicators don't fit the front panel we've got, so some modification is needed. And almost as predictably, Nick isn't happy with the position of the loom access hole, so another one is drilled into the lamp bowl before being screwed into place. The side repeaters go in, and that's all the lights in the front end ready to be wired up. I have to say, that looks really good. As I mentioned earlier, we're using the excess cabling from the end of the MG loom to hook up the lights. It might be that we need one or two short extension pieces, but with a bit of luck, that won't be necessary. We whipped up a few more cable tie mounts, along with a slightly more substantial anchor point, and these get welded onto the frame before putting the ties in place, ready to fix the wiring. The sealed connector we're using has these little green grommets that go over the individual wires and locate in these round holes on the back of the plug. The orange seal around the inside also guards against water and dirt ingress. Nick carefully threads the grommet onto the wire. Then it's just a case of stripping off the end, crimping the terminal on, and then fixing it in the connector. Nick kindly allowed me some quality time with the crimpers so I could get on with sorting the car side of the lighting connection. He's such a love sometimes. With the plug all sorted, the cables now get laid out on the frame. We're running to the offside lights through the bottom tube of the flip front frame. It's nice and neat, protects the wires, and you know, it's almost like we designed it like this in the first place. Almost. With the wires now running where we want them, the headlight plugs get attached. As do the side lights, the side repeaters and, of course, the indicators. Nick's welding on a little tab here so we can attach an empty female receptacle, so when we pull the flip front off, there's somewhere neat to attach the plug to. Keeps it out of the way. Right, let's see how all that looks with the front end back on the car and everything tucked away and cable tied up neatly. I'll be honest, we were really happy with how this turned out. As is customary with our build, what in theory was a quick and easy job turned out to be anything but. However, all the puncture wounds and blisters were worth it when the plan you formulated over a few brews turns out exactly as intended.
We're not planning on running any spotlights, which means that the entire front lighting is wired in. So it now makes sense to me to move to the back, wire those in, and that's the entire lighting circuit done.
The rear lighting should be a little easier as there's no flip front involved. All the wiring we need is contained within this loom, and it all terminates in this plug. It's a good idea to clip them together to make sure all the colours match up before you cut anything, as sometimes the manufacturers like to screw with us. Like this fuel pump wire, which mysteriously changes from white and purple to green and yellow. They're buggers, I tell you. After depinning the big plug, we pass the wires through from the boot into the passenger compartment. Our anti-snag tube gets put to good use here. This part is basically just deciding a cable route and making sure that the wires we've got are long enough. I think it looks like we'll be okay. With the path decided on, we can now weld in a bunch of the little cable tie attachments all along the route.
We pushed the boat out a bit and got two spanky new rear light units to aim at, and we've managed to source the correct pins to wire to them. What we have failed to find, however, is the correct plastic connector housing for those pins. We can get all the other ones in the series, but not the 4-pin one that we want. Not a problem, we thought. We've still got the old ones on the mini loom. Unfortunately, they are way too far gone to be reused. So we're going to swerve the whole problem and just change the entire connector for a more modern one.
Being forced into changing the fitting on the light means that should we need to replace it, it'll cost us another plug and a little time. Now it's time to push the wires back through and repin the plug.
Two pins.
Seemingly out of nowhere, an extra little tab has appeared on the bottom of the fuse box bracket, perfectly placed to hang this connector on. With the plug secured in place, we can now cable tie the wiring down to the floor and all along our carefully chosen path. Nick has a habit of leaving the cable tie tails on, which he knows drives me round the twist. It's one of my buttons. So while he points Percy at the porcelain, I whip them off with my trusty side cutters. So the route rearwards is along the floor, up along the underside of the seat base, through the chassis tube, up the seat back, along the parcel shelf, and down the back panel to the light. And again, one of those little connector mounting posts has turned up. Very nice. The earth for the whole rear light unit is taken to this little spade connector, and while it's perfectly acceptable to use these pre-insulated terminals, for not a lot more cash, you can get these OEM looking terminals, which is what we'll be using for that factory fresh look.
While we're on the subject, here's an Ed China styly top tip for you. If you're wiring up a multi-circuit anything to a single earth, and this applies particularly to lights, make sure you spec your earth wire big enough to handle a worst case scenario. The bulbs in these lights handle about 1 amp a piece, so if you spec 2 amp wire for the feed, gives you a bit of leeway. But, worst case scenario, you're backing out of a ditch with your foot on the brake, with your hazards on in the dark, all 4 bulbs are putting the same current through the earth, so you need to make sure it's big enough to wire the total current. If you're now thinking, oh bugger, I might just have done something wrong, don't feel too bad. So did BMW with the E60 rear lights.
We've wired the offside lights in the same way. Now we can wrestle with the tailgate to hook up the number plate lights. These are on new Japanese motorcycle spec bullet connectors. Much like the originals, only better. With the number plate lights sorted, now all we need to complete the look is a fog light. It's very red,
Isn't it?
with the fog light in, that should be it for the rear lights. Except that Nick wants a high-level brake light, for safety. The MG unit was designed to go in the spoiler and is massive, so we're using one out of a Citroën C2, which is much more compact, easier to mount, and it has its own housing. A couple of little brackets with captive nuts, and the light gets screwed in.
Ladies and gents, the high-level brake light. One of the only pieces of nanny state legislation that actually seemed to work. Or at least it did, until everyone got conned into buying lifestyle vehicles that are taller than a double-decker bus and ruined it for everybody.
Let's throw on the rear light lenses and chuck in an old sealed beam unit at the front. And then, well, suppose there's nothing left now to do except test it. Offside indicator, near side indicator, side lights, headlights, main beam, and hazards. That's fantastic. Let's check on the rear. Side lights, including the number plate lights, hazards, near side indicator, offside indicator, brakes, including the high-level brake light, reversing lights, and finally the fog light. Awesome!
Well, I would call that a successful conclusion to wiring in all of the lights. And the next bit of wiring we need to do involves the dashboard and switches and speakers and everything inside, which we're not ready to do yet, which means we've kind of run out of excuses to not look at the alternator situation.
Now we've been inundated with helpful suggestions on how to solve the alternator conundrum, so let's investigate a few.
Let's start with by far the most popular suggestion, which is to use the SW20MR2 rear engine mounted alternator bracket. I have one here. It weighs a metric ton.
Plus, there's no room down there because of the steering rack, which is why we had to remove the power steering pump and replace it with an electric one. We also looked at driving it from the prop shaft, or the rear diff and drive shafts, but there really isn't any room there either.
And unfortunately, the sad truth about driving around Britain nowadays is you spend an awful lot of your time stopped, which means we wouldn't be charging the battery.
We did even contemplate, like some of you suggested, a bicycle-style tyre-driven dynamo. Problem is, we haven't got any wheels.
You may laugh, but that's not as stupid as some of the suggestions we thought up ourselves, one of which is actually that intriguing we might have to investigate it in the future. But all of this round and round has led us pretty much back to where we started, thinking that the alternator has got no choice but to live here on top of the gearbox. And that's absolutely fine, if a tad conventional. The only slight issue is we do not have a direct line of sight from the pulley end of the engine to drive it.
We did consider a universal jointed shaft to run from one side to the other, but we felt the speeds involved here might be too much.
We can't really drive it off the back of the camshaft, even though we're not using the distributor, because we've got to drive the aircon pump and I'm worried about snapping a cam, and we need a pulley that's way too big to fit in the space available.
So this was all becoming a bit of a problem, until we came across an aerospace company in the UK that makes something that could be the answer to our prayers. This is a flexible shaft, or flexi shaft, and as the name suggests, it's a shaft that's flexible. You can bend it to a certain radius and still get drive from one end to the other. It wasn't cheap. To see how we use this to solve the alternator challenge, we have to travel back in time to when Nick's hair wasn't quite so unruly.
So the plan is this. We are going to take drive from the normal place on the nose of the crankshaft via a belt to the flexi shaft, which will then run along the back of the block under the inlet manifold to somewhere where we need it above the gearbox here. As you know, we haven't got a lot of room down the back of the block here, so we can only get away with running a very small diameter pulley on this end before we start interfering with the steering rack. Now, that would be fine if we were just running an alternator, but we also want this to drive an aircon pump, and I think that small diameter, combined with the extra load, is going to make the standard pulley setup slip. So, we're going to ditch the more usual multi-rib setup and move over to a toothed arrangement, much more like you'd find on a cam belt. The first step in this whole exercise is to take this pulley and make it fit like this original one, and hopefully take some gravity out of it as well.
The Celica's cast crank pulley weighs a cool 2.1 kilos, or 4.105 American cubits, and the new pulley starts off weighing nearly 2.7 kilos, or 5.142 yards? I don't know. Anyway, while Nick cracks on with the machining, I'm gonna get the funk out. The completed pulley now weighs 1.9 kilos, or 4.35 square feet.
Well, that was some good fun, and it's a good job, because now we get to do it all over again.
All right.
Nice. But of course, it's not that easy. You see, while this flex shaft will cope fine with the torque and the revs needed to drive the alternator, the little bearings in here are not designed to take the side load that we're going to get from tensioning the drive belt. So what we need is an intermediate shaft in a bearing carrier to go between here and here.
Before we can do any of that, we need a way of fixing the small pulley in the right position, rather than it floating around in 3D space. A flat bar with a couple of holes and an adjustment slot should do the trick. Now that the pulley position is fixed, we can take some measurements and start making the shaft. What we need now is a suitable length of bar stock.
And that is the intermediate shaft done. Yes, I've got a shiny shaft. It might not be very big, but it's plenty stiff enough. Now all I need is somewhere to put it.
As I've always said, it's not what you've got, it's where you stick it. Fast forward montage coming right up. This is quite a nice looking bit of kit. Let's hope it works as intended. What we need now is a mounting plate, so we can bolt it to the back of the block. Ah, excellent. You're already on it.
I think we may have just found the limit as to how hard we can push the little Taig mill, but it did the job just about. And with that mounting bracket done, that's everything we need on the driving end of the flexi shaft sorted. So we can now turn our attention to the driven end. What we need is a coupling to get drive from the end of the flexi shaft into the alternator. But the alternator also needs its pulley on it so we can drive the aircon pump. And that whole assembly needs to somehow mount to the top of the gearbox. So I think sorting that mounting out is probably the first step.
Well, that's great, but that isn't even half of it.
Woohoo!
Ah, good. The other not even half of it is finished. Ooh, here's the spider bracket thing we've been waiting for. But we're still missing one or two bits. Excellent. These really are the parts we're looking for. A top hat style drive flange and a 6pk V-belt pulley. Oh, here's some sundry items to help fit the whole assembly together. And here's all the bits to make this system we dreamed up work. As you can probably tell, there's an awful lot of work here completed over many weeks, but now we can bring it all together and show you how it all works. The new bottom pulley is connected via a toothed belt to a pulley half the size, so it's now turning at twice crank speed. The pulley is keyed onto an intermediate shaft in a bearing housing, which can be moved in the slots on the mounting plate to tension the belt. The flexi drive is connected to the shaft by a through bolt, and the outer is screwed into the end of the bearing housing and the jam nut is tightened. The flexi shaft runs underneath the inlet manifold and rises up towards the alternator. The outer casing of the end of the shaft is screwed into a spider type bracket, which in turn is mounted onto the main alternator and AC pump bracket. The inner part is keyed into a top hat shaped boss that has a cinch bolt to keep it from chattering. That boss is screwed onto a custom made V-belt pulley, which is attached to the alternator in the normal way. The V-belt drives the AC pump conventionally and is tensioned by an eccentric idler bearing. So there you have it, our solution to the ancillary drive conundrum. I think that's enough for this episode. Thanks for watching. Be sure to tune in next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky.